The most beautiful wedding in medieval Europe turned into the deadliest mass murder in royal history? What if I told you that over 400 of Europe's most powerful nobles sat down to feast at what they thought was a celebration of love and unity, only to drop dead one by one as poison coursed through their veins? And what if I told you that this massacre was so brutal, so calculated, and so politically devastating that it was literally erased from history books for centuries? This is the story of the poisoned wedding feast of Dijon. And by the time I'm done telling you what really happened on that blood-soaked night in the 14th century, you'll understand why this single event changed the course of European history forever. We're talking about a wedding that was supposed to unite two of the most powerful houses in Europe, but instead became their tomb. We're talking about a conspiracy so deep that it involved multiple kingdoms, secret councils, and assassins who made murder look like an art form. And we're talking about a cover-up so complete that most people today have never even heard of what historians are now calling the most successful political assassination in human history. So let me paint you a picture of medieval Europe in the 1300s, because this is not the fairy tale world of Disney movies and romantic novels. This was a time when your dinner table could literally be your death sentence, when your own family members were plotting your demise, and when a single wedding invitation could be a ticket to the afterlife. The major power players in our story are two massive royal houses that had been circling each other like predators for decades. On one side, we have the House of Trastamara, these ruthless Spanish nobles who were clawing their way to dominance across the Iberian Peninsula through a combination of strategic marriages, brutal warfare, and political assassinations that would make modern dictators blush. On the other side, we have the House of Burgundy, these French aristocrats who had been pulling strings across Western Europe for generations, controlling vast territories from the Low Countries down through parts of what we now call France. And they were not about to let some upstart Spanish house muscle in on their territory. But here's where it gets interesting, because somebody had a brilliant idea. What if instead of continuing this bloody feud that was tearing apart Western Europe, what if these two houses just joined forces? What if they sealed their alliance not with swords and treaties, but with something much more powerful and permanent? What if they united their bloodlines through marriage? And so the stage was set for what was supposed to be the wedding of the century. Princess Isabella of Castile, this absolutely stunning 22-year-old daughter of the Trastamara line, was going to marry Prince Thierry of Burgundy, this handsome and politically savvy heir to the Burgundian throne. This wasn't just any wedding. This was going to be the power move that would reshape the entire political landscape of medieval Europe. The preparations for this wedding were absolutely insane, and I'm talking about a level of opulence and political theater that would make modern celebrity weddings look like backyard barbecues. They chose the Grand Ducal Palace in Dijon as their venue, and let me tell you, this place was transformed into something out of a fever dream. We're talking silk-draped walls imported from the Far East, orchestras flown in from Italy, silver platters so massive they required multiple servants to carry, and guest accommodations that were literally more luxurious than most people's permanent homes. But here's the thing that really blows my mind about this whole setup. Over 400 of Europe's most powerful nobles were invited to this celebration. We're talking about kings, queens, dukes, duchesses, cardinals, and basically anyone who was anyone in the medieval political scene. This guest list read like a who's who of European royalty, and every single one of them saw this wedding as either an opportunity or a threat. Because you have to understand the stakes here. This marriage wasn't just about love or even political alliance. This union would have consolidated territories stretching from Spain through France and into the Low Countries, creating a power bloc that would have dominated Western European politics for centuries. Popes were watching this wedding. Kings were calculating how it would affect their own kingdoms, and enemies were plotting in the shadows because they knew that if this marriage succeeded, the entire balance of power in Europe would shift overnight. But there was someone who was absolutely not having it, and his name was Henry of Trastamara. Now let me tell you about Henry, because this man was the definition of a medieval political psychopath. This guy was Princess Isabella's uncle, and he had clawed his way to power through a series of executions, assassinations, and political machinations that were brutal even by medieval standards. Henry had spent years eliminating his rivals, including his own half-brother King Peter of Castile, who had previously been known as either Peter the Cruel or Peter the Just. depending on which side of his sword you found yourself on. Henry saw this wedding alliance as the ultimate betrayal of Castilian interests, and he was convinced that if Isabella had children with Thierry, those offspring would eventually challenge his own grip on power. So Henry started planning, and this is where our story takes a turn into pure nightmare territory. Because Henry didn't just want to stop this wedding, he wanted to send a message that would echo through the halls of European power for generations. He wanted to show every noble house in Europe that crossing the Trastamaras would result in consequences so severe that they would never dare to try it again. And the weapon he chose was poison, which was the perfect tool for someone like Henry, because it left no fingerprints, it could target multiple victims simultaneously, and it could be disguised as natural causes if you were clever enough about it. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. Instead of targeting just Isabella and Thierry, Henry was going to wipe out entire bloodlines in a single night. He was going to turn what was supposed to be the most beautiful celebration in Europe into a mass grave, and he was going to do it right under the noses of hundreds of witnesses who would be powerless to stop it. The wedding celebrations lasted for 3 days, and by all accounts, those first 2 days were absolutely magical. Guests were treated to entertainment that included everything from elaborate theatrical performances to hunting expeditions to musical concerts that featured the finest musicians in Europe. The food was legendary, with courses that included exotic spices from the East, rare wines from the finest vineyards, and delicacies that most people could never dream of tasting. Everyone was having the time of their lives, and Isabella and Thierry seemed genuinely happy together, which makes what happened next even more heartbreaking. But on the final night of celebrations, something changed. The final dinner course was announced as a special dessert featuring candied fruits and Sicilian wine, presented as a toast to the new couple's future happiness. The servants brought out these elaborate silver platters, piled high, with what looked like the most beautiful confections anyone had ever seen, accompanied by goblets of wine that sparkled like liquid gold in the candlelight. The guests raised their glasses, toasted to love and unity and the bright future ahead, and then they ate and drank what would be the last meal many of them would ever consume. Within minutes, the symptoms began. It started with a few guests complaining of nausea and dizziness, which initially everyone assumed was just the result of 3 days of heavy celebration and rich food. But then the vomiting started, and then people began collapsing right there in the banquet hall. Princess Isabella, who had been laughing and dancing just moments before, suddenly doubled over in agony and began convulsing so violently that it took 4 servants to hold her down. Prince Thierry tried to help her, but within minutes he was experiencing the same symptoms, and soon the entire banquet hall descended into absolute chaos as dozens of Europe's most powerful nobles collapsed simultaneously. The death toll was absolutely staggering. Princess Isabella died within 3 hours, her young life cut short just as she was beginning what should have been a fairy tale marriage. Prince Thierry lasted until morning, spending his final hours in agony as the poison slowly shut down his organs one by one. But they weren't the only victims. Entire noble families were wiped out in a single night. Some bloodlines that had ruled for centuries were extinguished forever, and the political ramifications were immediate and devastating. Now here's where this story gets then more twisted, because while Henry of Trastamara was the obvious suspect, he had covered his tracks so well that no one could prove anything. There were other theories floating around, including the possibility that a vengeful dismissed court cook had decided to take revenge on the entire nobility, or that agents from rival kingdoms like Navarre or Aragon had orchestrated the massacre to prevent the Trastamara-Burgundy alliance. But everyone with half a brain knew that Henry was behind it, because this kind of calculated mass murder was exactly his style, and he had both the motive and the resources to pull it off. The immediate political consequences were absolutely catastrophic. The Burgundian court immediately withdrew all support from Castile. Multiple noble families lost their heirs, and some entire houses went extinct overnight, and the resulting power vacuum led to renewed conflicts across France and Spain, as rival factions seized lands and titles that suddenly had no clear owners. The Grand Ducal Palace in Dijon was abandoned for over a decade because locals believed it was cursed, and the very phrase "wedding feast" became a sinister term in diplomatic circles that made people's blood run cold. But here's what really gets me about this whole story. The security revolution that followed this massacre changed royal protocol forever. Monarchs across Europe immediately instituted new security measures for banquets, including mandatory food tasters who would sample every dish before it reached royal lips, kitchen security that was locked down and guarded like military fortresses, and diplomatic protocols that treated every invitation as a potential death sentence. The paranoia that followed this event fundamentally changed how European royalty operated, and those changes lasted for centuries. Yet despite the massive impact of this event, something really strange happened in the historical record. Unlike other famous massacres and political assassinations that were recorded in detail and remembered for generations, the poisoned wedding feast was systematically erased from official histories. The deaths were officially listed as resulting from unfortunate illness, and most chronicles from the period either don't mention the event at all or describe it in such vague terms that you can barely tell what actually happened. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate cover-up orchestrated by people who understood that the truth was too embarrassing, too destabilizing, and too implicating of future rulers to be allowed to survive. But the cover-up wasn't perfect, and if you know where to look, you can find traces of what really happened in personal letters, private diaries, and coded references in later chronicles. One particularly chilling quote from a survivor's diary reads, "The devil drank among us that night, and he wore the face of kin," which pretty clearly suggests that the killer was someone the victims knew and trusted. The investigation that followed, such as it was, turned up some fascinating suspects beyond Henry himself. There was Martino Leas Zuniga, a minor courtier with a checkered past who mysteriously disappeared on the night of the feast and was never seen again. There was Guillaume Duval, the palace steward who was found hanged in his chambers just days after the massacre in what was officially ruled a suicide, but which many suspected was actually a silencing. Most intriguingly, there were reports that Henry had held a secret council meeting just 3 weeks before the wedding with his most trusted advisor, a man known as Sancho de Estúñiga, who had earned the nickname Sancho the Knife for his skill at orchestrating assassinations that looked like accidents. But the conspiracy may have been even deeper than just Henry and his Spanish allies. There's evidence that the French court under Charles V may have given unofficial approval to measures that would keep Burgundy from becoming too powerful, and King Peter IV of Aragon was reportedly monitoring the wedding preparations very closely and may have had his own agents working to sabotage the alliance. This wasn't just a family feud, this was an international conspiracy involving multiple kingdoms that all had reasons to prevent the Trastamara-Burgundy union from succeeding. The families of the victims responded in ways that were both heartbreaking and revealing. Queen Blanca, Isabella's mother, retired to a monastery and spent the rest of her life in mourning, never speaking publicly about her daughter's death. Philip the Bold commissioned memorial artwork that contained hidden symbols of protest and accusation, creating a coded artistic record of the massacre for those who knew how to read it. The entire cultural approach to royal marriages changed virtually overnight, with unions that had previously been seen as celebrations of love and political cooperation, now viewed as dangerous vulnerabilities that exposed entire bloodlines to attack. Some guests did survive the massacre, and their stories are absolutely fascinating. Lady Agnès d'Ourbon, who became known as La Miraculeuse, or the Miraculous One, survived because she had refused the final dessert course, claiming later that she had a premonition of danger. Lord Etienne de Savoie lost both of his sons in the massacre and subsequently became a knight hospitaller, dedicating the rest of his life to caring for the sick and dying. These survivor stories became the stuff of legend, and the theological implications of the event led to intense debates within the church about how such evil could occur during what was supposed to be a sacred ceremony. The long-term political evolution that resulted from this massacre was absolutely staggering. Royal betrothals across Europe began to be delayed or cancelled for mysterious health reasons, and a new profession emerged around culinary security and toxin detection, leading to the formation of the first formal guild dedicated to keeping royal food safe. Ironically, the fear of outside threats led to an increase in cousin marriages within royal houses, as families decided that marrying within their own bloodlines was safer than risking alliances with potential enemies. This trend toward inbreeding had devastating consequences centuries later, contributing to the genetic disorders that plagued dynasties like the Habsburgs. The cultural impact of the massacre extended far beyond politics into literature, music, and theater. Ballads about the event became popular across Europe, with La Noche del Vino Roto, or The Night of the Broken Wine, becoming one of the most famous songs of the medieval period. Theatrical companies began performing morality plays about the dangers of ambition and the divine retribution that awaited those who pursued power through evil means. The event even inspired advances in early forensic medicine and toxicology, with the University of Bologna establishing formal toxicology lectures just 14 years after the massacre. From a theological and philosophical perspective, the massacre raised profound questions about divine justice, political morality, and the nature of power itself. Some religious thinkers interpreted the event as divine punishment for the decadence and corruption of the nobility, with influential sermons like Friar Matteo de Florencia's God's Cup, arguing that the poison was actually God's judgment on a corrupt system. Political philosophers began calling for more codified diplomatic systems and international laws that could prevent in such tragedies, with works like Father Rodrigo Ferrandez's Of Feasts and Failures serving as early precursors to modern international law. During the Renaissance, interest in the massacre was revived by scholars and writers who saw it as a perfect example of the systemic failures of medieval politics. Don Íñigo de Loyola, who had been a young page at the feast and witnessed the massacre firsthand, became a chronicler in his later years and wrote detailed accounts of what he had seen, though he disguised his work as fiction under the title The Feast of the Fireflies to avoid political repercussions. The dynastic consequences of the massacre continued to reverberate for generations, with succession crises erupting across multiple kingdoms as the deaths created power vacuums that took decades to resolve. The Vatican's response to the massacre was particularly interesting, with emergency church councils being convened to assess the theological and political implications of the event. Informal poison protocols were developed and passed down through generations of church officials, and rulers like Queen Margaret of Denmark implemented rigorous food testing procedures that became models for other courts. Superstitious practices around wedding celebrations persisted for centuries, with northern Spain developing grape taboos and folk traditions that lasted well into the 1800s. Modern scholarship has revealed the massacre to be even more significant than previously understood, with Renaissance scholar circles like the Hijos de la Cifra, or Children of the Code, analyzing the systemic failures that made such an event possible. Early diplomatic theorists used the massacre as an argument for transparency and third-party arbitration in international relations, and some historians argue that the event was actually a catalyst for the evolution of modern diplomacy and the development of peacekeeping alliances. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all, recent analysis of surviving personal letters between Isabella and Thierry reveals that their relationship was based on genuine affection rather than just political calculation, making their deaths even more tragic and senseless. These two young people, who might have actually found happiness together while also creating a more stable political situation in Western Europe, were murdered before they ever had a chance to see what their union might have accomplished. The legacy of the poisoned wedding feast extends far beyond medieval history into our modern understanding of trust, power, and political violence. The phrase, "another Dijon," became diplomatic shorthand for catastrophic failures of international relations, and the event served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrating too much power in the hands of individuals who lacked moral constraints. In many ways, the massacre was a perfect reflection of the darkest truths about medieval politics, where personal loyalty was rare, family bonds could be deadly, and the pursuit of power often led to consequences that destroyed the very thing people were fighting to control. What makes this story so compelling even today is how it demonstrates that some of the most significant events in history are also the most hidden, and that the forces that shape our world often operate in shadows and silence, rather than in the bright light of public attention. The fact that this massacre was successfully erased from official history for so long shows just how much power those in authority have to control the narrative and decide which truths survive and which ones disappear. But it also shows that the truth has a way of persisting, even when powerful people try to bury it, and that stories like this one eventually find their way back to the light where they belong. So the next time someone tells you that medieval politics was just about knights and castles and romantic ideals, remember the story of the poisoned wedding feast and the hundreds of innocent people who died because one man's ambition was more important to him than human life. Remember that behind every fairy tale castle and every beautiful ceremony, there were real people playing deadly games with stakes so high that they were willing to commit mass murder to win. And remember that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who smile at you across the dinner table while they're planning your destruction, because in the game of medieval politics, trust was the rarest currency of all, and the price of misplacing it could be your life.